Hello guys and welcome to the forest. In today's video I'm going to be talking about the different eras of Pokemon and what I propose we should refer to them as the TCG community. There's a lot of different ways we can look at this, and I looked at this a couple of different ways too. My first instinct was to look at it from more of a art standpoint, looking at naming the individual eras based on what was involved with them and the characteristics of each era. So I'm going to be looking at Gens 1 through 9 and coming up with a little bit of sorting for them so we no longer get falsely advertised packets saying this contains something vintage in it when it's really Gen 5 or Gen 6. And we know in our hearts as a community that we don't really consider those cards to be really vintage. Starting off, we are going to look at Gen 1 and Gen 2. And this one is pretty easy to come up with the name for because the name that people already use makes a ton of sense for it. Gen 1 and Gen 2 are the Wizards of the Coast era because that is what company that was printing them, and continuing to refer to them by that name makes too much sense to quit. However, if we went into the artsy classifications, I think that Classic and Neoclassic makes a lot of sense for Gen 1 and Gen 2, because Gen 1, that is classic Pokemon, and Gen 2 is, funnily enough, Wizards of the Coast named those packs Neo, and I think because of that, Neoclassic really works very well. Now, I think Gen 3 and Gen 4 would make a lot of sense being called the Pokemon Company era, because this is really where the Pokemon Company and took over the rights to print their Pokemon cards, so this is where they really started off. Now, Gen 3 was where the Pokemon Company were getting their feet under them printing the cards, so there's some rough spots happening in the early cards. There are some really great cards in Gen 3, but because Pokemon Company didn't really know what they were doing printing cards, I think that's very easily divided into early Pokemon Company, and Gen 4 is where they really started getting their feet under them, really knowing what they're doing. I feel like Gen 4 is called the golden age of the Pokemon Company. For Gen 5, I'm going to use a term that will confuse a lot of you guys because it's more of an art term than a general use term. I feel like Gen 5 is the modern era of Pokemon, because that is where Pokemon, as we perceive it in the modern space now, really got its start with the concept of online Pokemon playing. The Pokemon trading card online was first happening in Gen 5. Pokemon events were getting live streamed. How the modern kind of idea of two prizers and how decks were really being built, the game space really started kicking off all in Gen 5. And that makes Gen 6 the postmodern era of Pokemon. And I feel like this is very adequate, not just because it's right after Gen 5 and post just means it's right after, but because I feel like a lot of what Gen 6 was doing was very, in essence, super similar to what Gen 5 was doing, just a little bit of different things here and there, but all in all, the gameplay, how the Pokemon Company was broadcasting, sharing its info and stuff, it was very similar to Gen 5. Now, getting to Gen 7 and Gen 8, it can get a little tricky to name things after you use words modern and postmodern. This happened in the art world too. It's a whole convoluted mess. But I feel like Gen 7 and Gen 8 are the contemporary era of Pokemon. Early Gen 7 is more of a Gen 6 postmodern thing because you had evolving into two prizers from single prizers. But once the tag teams came in, the three prizers, the combo game, that really gets its start in Gen 7, though there is some of it in Gen 6. Gen 7 is where the three prizers and power creep really takes off, and that trend continues in Gen 8, making how we play Pokemon today very different than it was early Gen 7 or Gen 6, and completely different from Gen 5. Therefore, I feel like Gen 7 and Gen 8, that's the contemporary Pokemon. Now, here is a little bit of a prediction for Gen 9. My hopes and dreams is that Gen 9 will be a renaissance. I'm really hoping it's going to be a renaissance, looking back to Gen 3 and how early Gen 7 worked. The power creep is never going to go away, but I hope the gameplay will become less combo heavy, less knockout, and then there's a game, but more of a back and forth kind of struggle to win the games. And I'm hoping that is what Game Freak is kind of promising with Gen 9, and I hope that is what comes to pass. So I'm hoping that Gen 9 and possibly Gen 10 become the renaissance of the Pokemon TCG. Now, those are a lot of complicated, very over-engineered words and categories for the Pokemon generations. So I came up with a couple of other options that are probably going to be more likely to be used by the common folk. Here are some buzzwords that I feel like apply very well. These are still in the categories. It's split up a little bit more, so when the buzzwords are used, we as a community know specifically what they're talking about. I feel like Gen 1 and Gen 2 are vintage and that's never going to change. But Gen 3 and Gen 4, I feel like using the word retro will create some clarity between Gen 1, Gen 2, and Gen 3 and Gen 4. Gen 5 is old school because of the modern idea. It's like, this is old school Pokemon, modern Pokemon as we know it. We know it very well, but it's the oldest version of modern Pokemon. Gen 6 is more of a throwback, and then Gen 7, and soon to be Gen 8, is just going to be called Last Generation, and I know that doesn't cover everything, and as we go on throughout time, we're going to have to come up with more terms for it, but here are the ideas I have right now for completely renaming everything. That is super over-engineered, over-complicated. So here is basically, I feel like, what everyone is already doing, but just needs a little bit of clarification. Here's a very simple 3-step process. Gen 1 through Gen 4 are vintage cards. It includes the Wizards of the Coast and the early Pokemon Company, and I feel like vintage is a fair catch-all term for all of them. Gen 5 through Gen 7 are old school cards. Because they're old eras of competitive Pokemon, it doesn't feel like they match Gens 1 through 4, so Gen 5 through 7 are old school. Gen 8 is our current/modern era. Gen 9 is just the next generation. This is a lot more simple and a lot more clean cut, and probably will be easier to implement into the general lingo of society, but I can't help but over-engineer things a little bit. I hope you found this video at least a little bit entertaining, and if you did, please be sure to hit that subscribe and like button, and let me know down below if this was over-engineered or if you have any other ideas about how to classify the Pokemon generations, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!